Good afternoon. It is the third Thursday of the month at 3 p.m. Eastern, which means it is Third Ear Thursday. I'm Nancy Schick of Third Ear Conflict Resolution. We do this every month at 3 p.m. Eastern on the third Thursday of the month. That's why it's Third Ear Thursday. And I like those threes to help you maybe remember what time to come join us. And today I'm here with Lee Shull, who is a civil rights auditor, not a civil rights attorney, but civil rights auditor. So, Lee, why don't you tell us a little bit about what that is, how you got into this work, and walk us through what a civil rights audit would look like.
Sure. Just, I guess, a little bit of background on how I arrived here. It's been a journey. I'll try to make it, short, and
You don't
folks,
have to.
if
Just
there's
share.
any interest, folks can ask questions afterwards. But so I actually have a almost 30-year career in IT systems transformations with large scale software called SAP, and but about 20 years through that, I live in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, and the was affected, like so many people in our community, by the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, which actually started in my neighborhood and activated me to actually start, initiate, and co-found a national nonprofit called Sandy Hook Promise. During that early stages of that, I found myself sitting next to one of the mothers who lost a child there in a church in North Hartford, and which is predominantly Black church, and listened to the pain of 8 to 10 women talk about how their children are dying on the streets every day and they don't get any attention. And I had known, racism existed in our country. I've traveled around enough. But that really started me on a journey to expand the lens of violence, study violence as a public health issue. And then when I dove into that, I realized, as a public health issue, when you look at the causes of violence, aside from suicide with a firearm, the predominant cause that I can tell is systemic inequity. And so when I left my last corporate job due to health reasons, I reflected on what it was that motivated me and energized me after in the formation of Sandy Hook Promise. And I decided to make a career shift, over a series of months. And I've just been working towards that, and been a diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging consultant. And then last summer, I had the opportunity to join a first ever cohort to be trained as a civil rights auditor. Something which I hadn't heard of before, and many people haven't heard of because it's relatively new.
And that's why I had you come on.
The first was done, I believe, in 2016 with Facebook and Airbnb around that time. Both of those resulted from major kind of PR crises. That's one way that a civil rights audit can come about. Another way is through shareholder voting, through proxy voting at annual shareholders meetings. Stakeholder groups, employees, unions can lobby basically and try to force companies to undergo a civil rights audit. The third way is voluntary, which I don't think that's happened yet. But as we'll get into today, I think it makes sense to dive into a little bit about what a civil rights audit is. And from my perspective, what I've been trained on is through PolicyLink, who published some standards in July of 2024 of what's encompassed in a civil rights audit. It goes beyond a DEI audit. So it does work, it does encompass that, but it also looks at a company's products or services and whether those discriminate or have any bias. Their philanthropic giving, their lobbying. Does bias show up in those practices? And also in their operations. So in the communities they reside in, are they having a disparate impact on communities where they reside? Think about chemical or maybe refining, waste discharge or air pollution. Is that affecting, one community more than another? So, that's kind of the scope of it. And it should, be done by an independent, third-party independent auditor with rigor, and it should be comprehensive. And it should be made public to the public afterwards, which most to date have been. But what's different is most of them have been conducted by a handful of law firms. which I don't think I would consider them independent, because they, there's a little bit of conflict in wanting to stay on and, keep earning money with that client.
Yeah, and as a lawyer myself, I can say, I can see the incentive, and it does seem from an investigatorial standpoint, when I'm involved in fair and impartial investigations of complaints, one of the key benefits of having me as an outside is it is a one-off in most cases, right? We want it to be a one-off, right? And because we want to then fix things, and I don't think necessarily a law firm can fix the problems once they've been identified, for example, with a civil rights audit. I think it's a good idea to have legal counsel look over it, but I like this idea of having an independent consultant who says, here's the data, and then the lawyer says, here's the law that applies to this data, but looking at it from a more holistic view with collaboration, I think,
Mm-hmm.
is one of the things I heard that when we've talked about this before, I hadn't heard before, is this idea of other ways that there may be bias showing up. And I've been learning a lot more about how to look deeper for the biases that are even well-intended. And I think that's a conversation we haven't really gotten into very much, but it sounds like this might show up on an audit where even though you're trying to do something in your mind that's good, sometimes your own bias is creating a problem you want to fix, or identifying a problem you want to fix, and you don't even realize that it's not necessarily what your employees want, what they're concerned with, or you might even do harm.
Mm-hmm.
And we've heard a little bit about this with biases that we have against maybe our own identity groups. And you can see how this identity politics sometimes plays out, where you may think you're doing something for the right reasons when really it's about you looking good, right? And I think there's some of that is starting to play out right before our eyes around DEI. So I appreciate that you're making us all think a little bit differently about not just are you in violation, which is what I would probably be looking for first, right?
Mm-hmm.
But are you doing the good that you want to do in the world?
Right, exactly. And, I think it's going to be a best business practice, right? I mean, organizations go through financial audits every year, right?
Right.
I think when you look at, and when people hear civil rights audit, I think there's maybe just a natural reaction to, to cringe a little bit or sit up straight. But it really is, it's almost like an organizational wellness audit, is the way I look at it. And to also just ensure that, look, in this field, especially people of my demographic, cisgender white male, I have a certain number of blind spots because of my identity. Corporations, it's no different, who are generally overrepresented with white men. So you can understand that, there may be unintentional, practices going on that we're not aware of, or just that we've been used to, all along. But, to be an inclusive company, the data shows that those companies that are inclusive are more profitable and are more innovative. So it helps your business bottom line. And I look at it as risk mitigation. I look at it as an insurance plan to make sure, because settlements, for these types of things are not cheap. And I know corporations put money aside expecting a certain amount of litigation. However, especially these days, you don't know where it's going to come from, right? And I think it's so much on the forefront of people's minds right now. I think some of the pullback from, pulling cases that won't be charged by the EEOC, I think that's going to have a ripple effect, and that could send a signal to people that it's okay to maybe, operate with, possibly bad intention, or not be as, I guess, aware of what they're doing. Um, this, that administration and these practices aren't going to be that way forever. And so companies can't take, if they take their eye off of this, they're really putting themselves at further risk down the road.
Yeah, and I think you're definitely speaking my language, right? It's one of the things that I keep bringing up for people is that the law hasn't changed, right? As far as the foundational anti-discrimination laws, and depending on which state or states you might have employees, for example, if you're in the employment space, you may have people in Florida and New York, and their laws are very, very different. So yes, there's some pushback at the federal level, then the state level may have different laws. And ultimately it comes down to, you still have a responsibility to protect your employees from discrimination. And now that brings us into the Ames case, right? That we were talking about, the Ames versus Ohio Supreme Court decision that was decided last month, beginning of June. And that has now expanded our understanding of the protections in a way that it used to be that someone perceived to be in the majority, right? Someone like a white cisgender male or a white cisgender female, right? We might be deemed in the majority, and then we had this heightened standard in some of the federal district courts. And now the Supreme Court has said that doesn't exist. It's either discrimination or it's not. And that's what the courts are required to decide. So that's going to bring up some different conversations. And I think that's another great opportunity for these civil rights audits, because we're still talking about ultimately culture, and you're talking about inclusive culture. Yes, as a lawyer, I'm going to tell you, you need to be in compliance, of course, because that costs you a lot of money when you're not. But it's also looking at the intangible costs sometimes. It's the loss of those employees who leave because they don't feel included. And it's not hiring appropriately. Like, what we're really looking at, I think, at this point is all the systemic issues that were coming up before anyway. And we didn't think of them that way, right? When I was growing up, and I'm guessing you and I are not far from the same age, and we knew about civil rights. It was part of how we were raised in a world beyond the civil rights movement. But we didn't necessarily understand all of the implications and how woven into the fabric. Basically, the structures were built by elite white males, right? European of descent, right? That was largely how most of our systems were designed. But now we have tools that can say, okay, we get that that's what was the design was there, and it got us where we are. We can debate that, but it's not helpful for where we're going in the future. And I think that's the potential of these civil rights audits, is looking at, hey, your workplace is already diversifying. So how do we work together? And your workforce was also, just FYI, it was already diverse, even when you thought, hey, it's all white men. Right? Because not all of them thought the same. Not all of them came from the same educational background, financial background, maybe not even the same country, right? So there's always been diversity, and we've always had to learn to navigate. So talk to me a little bit about how you do it. So you do the civil rights audit, and then what kinds of options do you have based on what you discover?
Yeah. So, and I want to be clear too, when we talk about civil rights, I think people's normal thought process goes to race and gender.
Right.
But there are so many other identities like age. And to your point, the diversity within organizations today is, multi-generational, different religions, different just background experiences, lived experiences that people bring to the table. That's where that innovation kind of comes in, and different ways of thinking. So, at the end of an audit, essentially, I kind of liken it to, in my old days, kind of an IT roadmap, where, you've identified, where you are and where you want to be. An audit will point out, who, who did we interview, who was involved, what were the findings, what are the potential or the areas for improvement, and it essentially, in a way, the way I would do it is put it out as a roadmap, right? Here are the things that should be concerned with and rectify, essentially. I don't think necessarily that we would prescribe how to do that or who to do that, but we would point out, here are your risk areas, and maybe put them in order of, critical risk, and therefore prioritize what you should work on going forward. And then, also to periodically to come back and do another audit to see how far have you progressed, has anything new come up in that time frame, et cetera. And I also think, again, in this time period, with the Ames case, and the Supreme Court was unanimous, 9-0. Like, discrimination against anybody is discrimination, which makes sense. And I think there's going to be more, litigation or claims of discrimination, by white people. So an audit, again, looks at discrimination, period. So why not, in this time, undergo an audit and just make sure you're not discriminating against anybody? And you can hold that up to your shareholders, to investors, to an administration, should they come knocking on your door, to say, we've done the work and we're confident that we're in compliance with federal and state laws.
Yeah. And I hear in that also this, again, opportunity for the consultants and legal and management and the board, right? I think this is the other thing we're seeing is a continuing movement toward more collaborative solutions. And that's something we've been talking about for most of my career, right? I started in management at United Parcel Service before I became a lawyer. And we were talking about these things back then, about how to get more participation, get more buy-in, so that we were really solving the problems that the people doing the job were having. And so I do see an opportunity in this, and I understand that a lot of people are nervous about it, but ultimately what it is, it's about valuing the people you work with. And I often will say, you've heard me say it, employment is a partnership, which means it's mutual. There's mutual benefit. When I go to work for somebody, I'm interviewing them as well as they're interviewing me, because we're trying to find compatibility. I do understand people take jobs just because they need money, of course. But in this world, we have a lot of opportunity to find great matches and do wonderful things together. And so that's the opportunity I see. But I want to go back a little bit to make sure that people understand what that audit might look like, because I hear it too when you said that, like, people go, oh, audit, scary. Because most times when we hear audit, we're thinking, oh, here comes the Department of Labor or the IRS. And those are usually two letters you don't want.
No, right.
So let's talk about how that audit or assessment might occur in an organization.
Yeah, whether it's through stakeholders that come with concerns from other people, whether it's employees, through unions or what have you, I view it, again, as you said, as a collaborative effort. And it's not, I don't see it as like a gotcha thing, like you're going in there, with malice. In my mind, my approach is, we're there to improve the company, both for the company's sake and the employee's sake. So, it should be at the outset setting the scope. What are maybe the claims that people feel need to be addressed, or if it's voluntary, it's more of an open, kind of a discovery with, conversations, interviews to understand different aspects of the company. And then, dialing into, okay, what's the scope of the audit? Is it all the products? Is it one sector of the products? And we are talking about US based, state and federal laws. So different, if it's a global company, excuse me. But yeah, so you just want to, kind of narrow in on the scope of what it is what products, what services, what geographies, what have you. And then once that's agreed upon, and again, that should be collaborative as well. I would say, take 3 months, for example, get that nailed down, and then have a discussion. Do we agree on the scope? And here's what we think it's going to take to do the rest of this. And much like an IT roadmap, the rest of that process should be regular check-ins, with a steering committee or an executive committee on what the progress is. Obviously, if there's anything that comes up, that somebody would consider a red flag, you raise it right away and you talk about it. You don't wait till the report's done. You go and have a conversation about what needs to be done there. And again, because I'm not a civil rights attorney, I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, though. I would work in partnership with a civil rights attorney. But by the end of that report, because you've had constant communication and feedback, when you get to the final report, you've already presented drafts. You've been working on it along the way. There should be no surprises. So when that final report is being reviewed and ready for publication, everybody in that room should be nodding their head that they're in agreement. Again, because it's been this collaborative practice, along the way.
Yeah, and I think something else that I'm learning as you're talking about this is that people think audit, they think it has to be of the whole organization, one whole department or something. But I like that you frame it also of you can use this if you identify one product or one service or one department, one type of project, right? And when you're talking about scope, I know that's the IT person in you as well that's coming out, which is I also something so beautiful because we learn a lot on, in both directions, right? From the IT and the HR and from the legal. This is something that I continue to see trends toward is this more interdisciplinary approach to problem solving. That's why diversity works. Right? Because these problems that we're experiencing as everything's changing at these rapid paces, I think we almost need to just accept that these kinds of ongoing audits of small pieces of our business are just part of the fabric. And I think that's something else that has potential with civil rights and DEI. HR generally, right? People skills, all of these conversations, we tried to put them in a department. And then what happened with those silos is the message didn't necessarily get out the same way. And so again, I go back to I'm usually pretty optimistic, so I'm going to lean that way and look for something to pull us into the future, something positive. And so I see a lot of opportunity in what you're talking about of tweaking as you go, just like you would with an IT product, just like you would in your family, in your community. And the more that we develop these skills in our businesses, because that's where we go, right? It's where we make our money that supports the lives we want. Totally get that. That's why I work in employment, right? Because I know that's the one place that most people are listening. And then we can just take these skills out more into the other areas that we want. And I love that starting there gives us the opportunity and then looking at, of course, what happened in Sandy Hook and seeing these systemic issues that create the opportunities for some of the biggest tragedies. So I see how it ties together, and I'm just curious if I'm hitting on that. How you got into this is that you see the bigger opportunity to go in and go back out. Is that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that morning, when I was in my neighborhood and the police were tying off yellow tape, none of us that were there understood why the tape was being tied off. There was a local CBS news crew and some, journalists there, and a friend called to tell me that there was a body reported down the street, and I didn't understand why. I had seen a SWAT truck drive down my street clad with men and guns, men or women with guns. Couldn't tell because of the armor.
Right.
Helicopters, I could see helicopters flying over the school. And when I learned that there was a body down the street, it was obvious it started in my neighborhood. And the CBS or the producer or whatever reporter asked me what I was thinking, and a microphone came up in front of me, and a camera showed up behind his shoulder, and I thought, okay, I have an opportunity, but I also felt the responsibility
Mhm.
to try to wake people up to say, I use the cliche, you never think it could happen in your neighborhood,
Right.
and which that's what they aired on television, but they cut the next piece, which was we as a society are partially responsible for what happened here, right? You could blame parenting all you want. You can blame, he fell through the school system or mental health system, but we didn't take, that person wasn't taken care of adequately, and obviously access to lethal means as well contributed to it. So yes, the fact that we as a society have a role to play, and in regards to civil rights or DEI, as a white guy, I'm not responsible necessarily for what happened hundreds of years ago when
Right.
you know we stole land and used stolen labor to build the country to what we are. But once I recognize that those things, those vestiges, are still inherent in our society, then I feel like I have a responsibility to kind of buck the status quo a little bit and try to make things fair.
Yeah.
So that's where I come from.
And I can relate a lot to that. I grew up in the public school system here in the United States and spent all my mornings and in so many of my classrooms, giving the Pledge of Allegiance, all of those things, and really believed in that, not getting the full story.
Mhm.
And I think I relate a lot to the way you see things. Of course, I wasn't there. I'm old, but I'm not 400 years old, right? And yet I can see that I have benefits that others don't have. But the conversations that I think we're moving toward also are true, but then there are always people that have privileges that others don't. So it's really the individual. So you do the micro and the macro, and that's what
Mhm.
I'm hearing in this, is it's the same thing with an audit. You do the micro sometimes when it makes sense, but you might want to do the macro. And then what you do is you start working at the micro level because that's more manageable. But
Mm.
it doesn't mean you're not still looking to make big change. It
Right.
just takes time and effort and commitment and collaboration. And I honestly can say, the more I'm out there talking to people, that this is what we want. We just haven't figured out how to do it. So I think there's a lot of possibility in what you're doing and coming together in conversations like this. I know you and I are in some of the same circles, so we're having these conversations probably at least weekly,
Mm.
but inviting people to watch this recording, those that aren't here with us, watch it. Tell us what you want to see. Tell us what's you're struggling with in your
Mm.
workplace, in your life. I'll go find people that can bring you something that might move you to the next step, because I think that's another big piece.
Yeah.
Is it's overwhelming to think that you're trying to, for example, go back to 1619. We
Right.
can't change that, but what
Mm.
we can do, like you said, is we can change where we are. We can look behind us and say, who needs a hand up? How can we help them? We can just be in community and in collaboration. And I think this is where a lot of people are moving, but they just need to know it's okay to take a small step and
Yeah.
keep taking small steps, because
Yeah.
that's how it's like, look, I want to run a marathon, then I'm going to start, not go out and run 26.2 miles
Right.
today. I'm going to have to train for that, and I think
Yeah.
that's part of what we're doing. But you have to know where you are first, right? And
Yeah.
anybody would be able to tell you that. Like, you gotta have the map. So I think this is a beautiful tool. Is there anything else you want to make sure that we know about doing civil rights audits?
Yeah, I would point to policy links, and you can look at the audit standards yourself. So it's not a mystery. Uh, the outline is there of what we would come in and look at as far as an audit, or what the potential areas are of why we are looking at all those things. So companies could actually start leveraging that now to think about where might they have issues. Um, and so, and I also, because it's a relatively new field, I would get a lot of questions just not knowing what a civil rights audit is. How
Mhm.
does it compare to other social audits like a racial equity audit or
Right.
a DEI audit or assessment or a culture review or human rights impact assessment? So what I did was, because it helped me to be able to answer that question, I put together an information sheet basically that aligns each of those social audits and the features of each, so
Mhm.
that people can understand, compare and contrast like you would a car or an appliance, right? What's different about these things that I'm looking at? According to scope, who's involved, resources involved, estimated cost of each, what the scope of each, what the intent is. So, that's out there on my LinkedIn page. People can feel free to use that as a reference for their own use. And then again, yeah, the standards on policy link are there, and they're also linked to in the document that I had, as well as resources for some of those other social audits as well.
Okay, great. So I'll put some links in the notes to the video for the people that are going to end up watching the recording. And you heard Lee is on LinkedIn, so make sure you go out and follow him because he's talking about these kinds of issues all the time. Um, where else can they find you?
Uh, I've kind of shied away from, pulled away from other social media, to be honest with you, because I don't want to continue with those
Understood.
algorithms and what have you. I do have a website, which is northstarconsulting.me, which is a little bit different, .me, where you can also find, some videos on how I got here as well. And those, that info sheet, and also another information sheet about cultural change and how large scale implementations run in parallel or have a lot of similarities to cultural change, implementing people change within organizations. And again, to your point, it's really it's got to come from the top, and they have to own it and believe in it and hold people accountable. It's not just IT, it's not just HR, it's a company wide effort, and it's a journey. Like, we're all on a journey, it starts with awareness of what we don't know. There shouldn't be any shaming or blaming involved. And, I invite white men to join the conversation. Maybe, they don't know how. Get in touch with me and I can point you to any number of, discussions or things that are going on to try to help accelerate that learning curve. Because once you see it, once you see the systemic inequity, I can't unsee it. And I feel a responsibility to do something about it. And by the way, I feel a lot better about myself because of it. And I know I'm a better leader because of it. And I know if I was running a company, my company would be better for it. So,
And you hit on some really beautiful points there is I think that a lot of white men, white women, we try to get into these conversations and don't really know how. So that's another reason that having this data is so helpful because it gives you a place to start having difficult conversations.
mhm.
And I like, of course, that you also brought up the no blaming and shaming. And that's one of the conversations that I want to end is the blaming and shaming, because that keeps us kind of stuck in the past. And if you stay in the past, you can't change much, right? You can't move into a different future if you keep recycling the past.
Right.
It doesn't mean the past doesn't inform us and it's not valuable. That's why we study history. It's why we have those conversations, but it's what we do with it that matters.
Yeah.
It's also why I mediate now instead of litigating, because in court, it's all about who did what and who deserves punishment of whatever form.
Mm,
And
mm,
sometimes that's completely valid. There are some offenses There are going to be some things that you might discover in your civil rights audit that need to be addressed. But that's not necessarily what we're going in with. We're not going in with the who's a problem that I need to fire, right?
Right.
What we're doing is, how do we keep getting better?
Mm-hmm.
How do we make change? So thank you for bringing that part into the conversation as well. I think that's going to be especially important as we learn to navigate the Ames case. And I'm going to be teaching on that at the end of the month for Law Line. For those of you that are attorneys, you can get your CLE credit by watching that course. But really what it's going to come down to is, are you addressing the people conflicts? And it's not just HR that needs to do it. And that's what we've done, is we've kind of channeled everything to these people that we think somehow are magical. And sometimes they are. I will admit, I've met some that are. But for the most part, this is about learning skills to navigate conflict, however it arises. And one of the number one ways that we're going to have conflict in our organizations and in our lives is when people come together, because we're all a little different. And then to remember, the reason you do these audits ongoingly, or at least however often you might feel the need, is because people are always changing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the other part. So we're inviting you to change, especially the things that aren't working. Right? So I love that I love the potential of all of this, and I appreciate you sharing a little bit about this. I don't see any questions at this point. So what I'll do is just say, again, if you have questions, put them in the comments to the video, because this will be on YouTube. It's being streamed now through LinkedIn and Facebook as well as YouTube. And then the recording will be out there. So we check our social media. We're in these conversations every day. We are here for you. So feel free to reach out to me or to Lee, and join us on some future videos in some of these future groups as well, because we're not going to get any better at these conversations if we're not having them.
Yeah, and we're learning, right? We're walking this journey with everybody. We may be just a few steps ahead,
Right.
but I'm constantly learning every day from people, whether they're considered an expert or not, right? We all have these different lived experiences, and we all can learn from each other. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
To be in community with people is the best way to learn and to get comfortable about having these conversations.
Yeah. Because those of you that are out there, you are the expert in your life, and I'm never going to fully understand, but I certainly will try. And that's the other part of this conversation, is Lee is here to do that. I'm here to do that. And I think we're all going to keep getting better at this. I'm not giving up on any of us.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. So thank you so much. And